It was the kind of morning that felt like any other in the quiet town of Ellenton, Georgia. Birds chirped lazily in the oak trees. The air carried the sweet scent of pine and dew, and neighbors waved to each other as they headed to work. But no one knew that by noon, that normal day would turn into a nightmare. A little girl named Maddie Ellis, just 7 years old, vanished without a trace from Magnolia Park, a place families trusted, a place kids ran free, the kind of place where nothing like that had ever happened before, until it did. Maddie wasn't just any girl. She was the kind of child you'd notice right away: bright eyes, wild curls, and a laugh that could make strangers smile. Her mom, Caroline, brought her to the park that morning like she always did on Saturdays. It was their ritual. Swing sets, juice boxes, then the short walk back home. But that day, something broke the pattern. Caroline turned her back for a moment to answer a call to tie her shoe. No one remembers exactly and when she looked. Again, Maddie was gone. What followed was panic. Real, raw, and instant. Caroline's voice cracked as she called her daughter's name again and again, first with confusion, then with pure terror. Within an hour, the park was swarming with people, officers, volunteers, reporters. Dogs were brought in, helicopters circled, and every inch of the park was searched, over and over. But nothing, no signs, no footprints, no clues. Maddie had vanished as if the earth had swallowed her whole. The town changed overnight. Magnolia Park, once filled with children's laughter, became a place of whispers and warnings. Parents clutched their kids a little tighter. Porch lights stayed on long after midnight. For weeks, the community held on to hope. Posters of Maddie's face were taped to mailboxes, pinned to telephone poles, and shared endlessly online. People dropped off food at the Ellis home. Candlelight vigils were held. But as days stretched into weeks and weeks into months, the hope began to fade. People started pointing fingers. Rumors spread fast in a town that small. Some said it had to be someone local. Others believed it was a traveler, someone passing. Through a few even blamed Caroline herself, unable to accept that something so awful could happen for no reason. But through it all, there were no answers. Just silence. Then one rainy Monday morning, exactly 6 months later, everything shifted. Paul Renshaw had worked as a janitor at Magnolia Park for over 20 years. A quiet man in his 60s, he swept the walkways, emptied trash bins, and kept to himself. He wasn't one for gossip, and most folks hardly noticed him. But that morning, as Paul was cleaning near the far edge of the park, the part that bordered the woods, he found something strange, something he'd never seen before. A small pink ribbon tied tightly around the base of a tree. It was worn and muddy, but unmistakably a little girl's hair ribbon. Paul froze. He remembered. Maddie. Everyone did. He called the police right away, and within the hour, investigators were back in the park, combing through an area they'd long ago stopped searching. And that's when things started to unravel. Beneath the ribbon, buried under a pile of leaves and broken branches, was something even more disturbing. A small wooden trapdoor, almost completely hidden beneath the forest floor. It didn't belong there. It wasn't part of any park structure, and it definitely hadn't been there before. The discovery sent shockwaves through the town, and within hours, the news had spread far beyond Ellenton. People from across the state tuned in, asking the same question. What was beneath that trapdoor? Authorities were cautious. No one knew. What they were dealing with, was it an old storm shelter? A root cellar? Or something far more sinister? The area was sealed off, and a forensic team arrived to investigate. Caroline Ellis was contacted immediately. She hadn't slept a full night in 6 months, and now she was being told there might finally be a lead. But hope, after so long, felt Dangerous, as investigators carefully opened the trapdoor, a heavy smell rose from the earth. One of the officers who had worked on the case from day one turned pale and stepped back. A ladder led down into darkness. It was narrow, cold, and silent. No one spoke for a moment. Then, one by one, they descended. Flashlights cutting through the pitch-black dot, what they found in that hidden space shook them all. It wasn't just what was there, but what wasn't. The room was empty. Mostly a dusty blanket in the corner. A child's shoe, crayon drawings taped to the damp walls. It was like someone had been there recently and had left in a hurry. Now the case had changed. Maddie might still be alive. That revelation reignited the town and the country. The idea that this little girl might have survived all this time gave people something to hold on to again. But it also raised 100 new questions. Who had built that room? How had it gone unnoticed for so long? And if Maddie had been there, where was she now? Carolyn stood outside the park as news cameras clicked around her, tears on her face. Hands shaking. "I never gave up," she whispered. "I knew my baby was out there, and she might be. But time was running out. Whoever had taken Maddie knew their secret was exposed. They could be on the move, or, worse, desperate. The investigation ramped up like never before. New leads, old suspects, reopened files. The entire town became a crime scene again. And through it all, one man, the janitor who'd found the ribbon, stayed quietly at the edge of it all, haunted by the thought that maybe, just maybe, he'd walked past that spot 100 times before and missed it. What really happened to Maddie Ellis? Who took her, and why? And what secrets still lie buried in the woods of Magnolia Park? The truth is darker than anyone. Paul Renshaw sat on his porch that night, staring into the distance, the rain gently tapping the metal roof above him. He hadn't been able to sleep since that morning, not after finding that ribbon, not after the trapdoor. His hands still shook every now and then, and the image of that little shoe in the corner of that underground room wouldn't leave his mind. It looked so small, like it had been slipped off in a rush. And those crayon drawings. Some were happy sunshine. Flowers, but others showed darker things. Eyes, shadows, a door with no handle. He couldn't make sense of it. But something about it all felt off. Felt wrong as he sipped his coffee, still in the clothes he'd worn to work. Paul thought back to the first few days after Maddie went missing. He remembered how the town changed, how parents stopped bringing their kids to the park, how everyone looked over their shoulder. He remembered how the police had swarmed the area, how reporters had camped out by the playground. But now he was starting to wonder, had they really searched everywhere? Had that trapdoor just been overlooked or hidden? The police, meanwhile, worked around the clock. They re-interviewed everyone who had been at the park the day Maddie disappeared. Carolyn Ellis was questioned again, gently but thoroughly. She described that morning in detail, just as she had countless times before, the way Maddie ran ahead to the swings, how she waved at an older couple walking their dog, how she begged for ice cream before lunch. It had been so ordinary. That's what haunted her the most. There had been no sign, no warning. Just a normal day shattered in a single moment. Detective Maria Benton had been assigned to the case from the start. A veteran with over 15 years on the force, she was known for being calm, focused, and relentless. She'd been the one to console Caroline on that first terrible night, the one who stayed at the park long after others had gone home. And now, with the discovery of the underground room, the case had taken on new life, and Maria was more determined than ever to find the truth. She stood in that hidden space for hours, flashlight scanning every inch. The ladder was old but sturdy. The walls were lined with rotting wood, the air damp and still. There were no windows, no locks from the inside. It was meant to keep someone in, not let them out. And yet, there was no blood, no sign of struggle. Just traces of someone who had lived there, quietly and secretly. The drawings became a focus. Forensics lifted them carefully, analyzing the fingerprints, the pencil pressure, the subject matter. One showed a figure standing in a doorway, holding something, maybe a toy, maybe a rope. It was unclear. But something about the figures. Eyes chilled Maria. They were wide, staring straight ahead, empty. Back in town, rumors picked up again. Some whispered that Maddie had never really left the park. That maybe she'd been taken by someone she knew. A retired school teacher remembered seeing a man in a green hoodie hanging around the benches that day, but no one else had noticed him. A jogger recalled hearing crying near the edge of the woods, but thought it was just another kid who'd fallen. Now every detail from that day was being picked apart all over again. Maria dug into park maintenance records, just to be thorough. That's when something strange came up. The area where the trapdoor had been found had been part of an old garden project, marked closed for restoration over 5 years ago. Since then, no major work had been done there. But a permit from last year had been signed for irrigation. Line access by a company that didn't seem to exist. When she called the listed number, it was disconnected. That permit had allowed someone to dig on that land without raising suspicion. Whoever had built that room had planned it. She started going through surveillance footage from the few cameras in the area. Most were outdated, grainy, or facing the wrong direction. But one camera, facing a maintenance road near the woods, caught her attention. 2 days after Maddie disappeared, just before dawn, a white van drove out of the park. No logo, no license plate visible. Just the van and the driver, a person wearing a ball cap, pulled low, barely glancing toward the camera. The footage was short, just 10 seconds. But it was the first real lead in months. Caroline, meanwhile, was torn between hope and fear. The discovery of that room reopened old wounds, but it also sparked something inside her, a flicker of belief that Maddie might still be out there. She began revisiting the park each morning, standing near the swing set, listening. Sometimes she swore she heard footsteps behind her. Other times she thought she saw movement in the trees. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was her mind playing tricks, but she couldn't ignore it. She wasn't alone in feeling that way. A few other parents admitted that their kids had mentioned strange things about the park in the weeks before Maddie vanished. One boy had said he saw someone watching from the woods. A girl described a sad lady who sat under the trees and disappeared when you got close. None of it made sense, but every little story added a layer to the growing unease. Paul, too, began questioning things he'd never thought about. He started walking the park earlier in the mornings, flashlight in hand. He retraced the path to where he'd found the ribbon. How long had it really been there? Had it fallen recently, or had it been placed? The more he thought about it, the more something didn't sit right. The ribbon was tied too perfectly to clean in a spot that was always muddy. Someone wanted it to be found. And then there was the strange smell. Paul remembered catching it once or twice over the past few weeks, faint, almost like chemicals or mildew. He dismissed it as runoff from the creek or trash left by teens. But now, knowing what lay underground, he wasn't so sure. He brought it up to Detective Benton quietly, unsure how it would sound. She didn't laugh or brush him off. She asked him to show her the exact spot he remembered it strongest. Together, they walked along the wooded trail, the one less traveled. The trees were dense there, the ground uneven. Paul stopped near a twisted pine and pointed. "Here," he said. "I smelled it more than once, mostly after rain." Maria bent down, studying the ground. Fresh moss, broken branches, a small rusted nail sticking up from the soil. She made a note and flagged the area for a deeper search. As night fell again over Ellenton, tension wrapped around the town like a fog. The trapdoor had opened more than a hidden room it had unlocked, questions that were never supposed to be asked. Someone had gone to great lengths to hide whatever had happened to Maddie. But why? And more importantly, how close were they still? The truth was out there, and the town of Ellenton was about to learn just how far someone would. Detective Maria Benton stood outside her car at the edge of the woods, staring at the yellow tape that flapped in the humid Georgia wind. The trapdoor discovery had sparked interest from the FBI now. A special agent had been assigned to assist, and reporters had returned in full force, parking their vans along the road near the park like vultures circling a fresh story. But beneath all the noise and attention, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that they were still missing something important. Whoever had taken Maddie hadn't just stumbled into it. This had been planned, built, maintained, hidden in plain sight for half a year. That didn't sound like impulse. It sounded like routine. Across town, Caroline sat on the couch with her sister Jen, staring at the latest crayon drawings the forensics team had sent over for confirmation. One of them, the one with the tree and the swing set, looked eerily like Magnolia Park. Another showed what seemed to be a basement with a small figure standing alone in the corner. It was rough, almost frantic in the way the lines scratched into the paper. Caroline's heart twisted with every image. If Maddie drew these, then she was trying to tell someone something. But what? Jen didn't know what to say anymore. For months, she'd been the one holding everything together, fielding calls, cooking meals, trying to be strong for Caroline. But now, seeing the drawings and hearing about the trapdoor, she felt that helplessness sinking in again. She kept thinking about Maddie's last birthday, 7 candles, a strawberry cake. How Maddie had made everyone sing twice just so she could blow them out again. The house had been filled with laughter. Now it was just quiet. Meanwhile, Paul Renshaw had started keeping a notebook. He didn't tell anyone, not even the police. But after finding the ribbon and watching the investigation erupt again, he started writing down things he remembered from the weeks leading up to the disappearance. He wrote about a strange car he saw parked near the restrooms, about a delivery truck that came to the maintenance shed but didn't drop anything off, about how, twice, he noticed food wrappers near the back fence where no one ever went. None of it made much sense on its own, but Paul knew the park better than anyone. Something had changed in those weeks. He just didn't realize it at the time. Then there was the matter of the anonymous call. 3 days after the trapdoor discovery, Maria received a voicemail late at night. The voice was distorted, clearly altered, and the message was short. "You're looking in the wrong direction. It's not about who took her. It's about who let it happen." Then the call cut off. No number, no trace. The message chilled Maria more than she cared to admit. She replayed it over and over, trying to catch a clue in the tone or phrasing. It didn't sound like a threat. Sounded like a warning. This led her to start asking deeper questions about the park itself. Funding records, hiring logs, maintenance work, and then she found something strange. A local security firm, Berkeley Patrol, had billed the city for 2 overnight checks of Magnolia Park the week Maddie went missing. But the city had no record of authorizing those patrols. And when Maria visited their office, she learned the guard assigned to those shifts, Nick Avery, hadn't shown up for work since mid-March. Right after Maddie's case went cold, Nick had no criminal record, no known connection to Maddie or Caroline. But digging a little deeper, Maria discovered he used to volunteer at the same church daycare Maddie had attended 2 years earlier. Nothing stood out at first. No red flags. But the overlap was enough to raise her concern. She added his name to the list. In the background, the town's anxiety began to swell. Some residents were angry, blaming the police for not finding the trapdoors sooner. Others were scared, wondering if the person responsible was still among them. The mayor called for calm, but people were restless. There were whispers of shutting the park down permanently. And on a quiet evening, someone spray-painted, "Where is Maddie?" in bold red letters across the front gates of the playground. One subplot that caught media attention was the involvement of an anonymous group calling themselves the Watchers of Ellington. They claimed to be a local coalition of parents and ex-law enforcement trying to expose hidden truths about the town. Their online posts hinted at a cover-up involving someone in city government, though nothing they shared was concrete. Rumors, suggestions. They published a list of people who'd worked at the park over the past 5 years, suggesting one of them might be involved. Maria knew it was dangerous throwing names out without evidence, but she couldn't ignore how some of their information matched things only insiders should know. Caroline, meanwhile, began having vivid dreams. Not the comforting kind. In one, she saw Maddie standing at the edge of the woods, staring at her without speaking. In another, she heard her daughter's voice calling from underground, distant and muffled. She woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. She kept these dreams to herself, mostly. But one morning, she confided in Paul when she saw him near the park gates. Paul didn't laugh. He didn't think she was crazy. He just nodded, like he'd felt something too. And maybe he had, because Paul had started hearing sounds. In the early morning, before the sun rose, footsteps, a cough, a twig snapping where no one should be. He'd shine his flashlight, but find nothing. Still, it felt like someone was out there. Watching, listening, the search efforts grew, and the FBI brought in ground-penetrating radar to scan areas near the trapdoor. They discovered a second chamber, nearby smaller, older, mostly collapsed. But inside, they found fragments of what looked like a child's toy, broken and buried deep. They were careful not to speculate, but the connection to Maddie seemed more likely with each day. Maria tried to keep her focus sharp, but the case was getting messier. Too many questions. Why build an underground room so close to the park? Why leave clues only to vanish again? And what did that voicemail mean? Who let it happen? She started pulling old cases. Missing kids, abandoned shelters, anything similar. And in a report from a neighboring county, she found something haunting. Nearly identical structure was found in the woods 12 years ago, used by a man to hide a runaway child. That case had ended in tragedy. The man died before revealing anything else. But a name from that file stood out to her, Nick, Avery's father, who had once been a suspect but was never charged. Now the pieces were moving, and somewhere, someone was watching them all move. The wind picked up across Magnolia Park, whistling through the trees with a kind of uneasy sharpness that hadn't been there before. Even the leaves seemed to rustle differently, like they were whispering secrets to anyone willing to listen. Paul Renshaw felt it in his bones every time he walked the trails now. That sense of being watched had only gotten stronger, and in the early hours just before dawn, he often found himself pausing mid-step, scanning the woods like a hunted animal. Something was stirring, and it was getting closer. Detective Maria Benton stayed late every night in her office, surrounded by maps, reports, photos, and scribbled notes. Every detail about the park was now committed to memory. But despite all the effort, something still didn't line up. The hidden room was too well constructed to be the work of just one person in secret. Someone had to have known, maybe even helped. And if they had, then they were still out there, living among the town like nothing had happened. Then came the breakthrough. Forensics found partial DNA on one of the crayon drawings, not Maddie's. It was a male profile, unknown in the system. But it proved one thing: Maddie hadn't been alone in that room. Whoever had kept her there had touched the paper, had been close enough to watch her draw. That realization hit Maria hard. This wasn't just about a missing girl anymore. It was about control, about power, about someone who'd been carefully planning every move. Caroline tried to stay strong, but she was unraveling. Each new update brought a wave of hope and fear. She kept wondering if Maddie had really been in that room. Then why hadn't she been found sooner? Why had no one heard her? And most of all, was she still alive? The thought of her daughter out there, maybe just miles away, needing help, hit haunted every second. One evening, Carolyn got a package. No return address. No note. Inside was a small bracelet, Maddie's. Beads missing, the elastic stretched out. Carolyn collapsed onto the floor, clutching it to her chest. The police ran every test they could, confirming it was real. The bracelet hadn't been touched by Maddie since she went missing, but whoever sent it had access to her belongings. Maria now believed they were being taunted. The person behind this wasn't just hiding. They were watching the investigation, playing a game. The white van from the surveillance footage became the central focus. A call finally came in from someone who thought they recognized it parked behind a local hardware store weeks ago. When the team checked the security cameras from nearby buildings, they found a clearer image, this time a symbol on the back window. Faded, but visible. It matched a decal from a no-closed children's learning center. It's just one town over. The center had shut down 3 years earlier after losing funding. Maria and the FBI raided the property with search dogs, hoping to find something. It looked abandoned. But in one of the storage rooms, behind an old filing cabinet, they found something chilling: a wall covered in photos. Not of Maddie alone, but of several children. Some old, some recent, some unknown. The photos were marked with dates and numbers, a timeline, a pattern. Maddie's photo had a red pin next to it. Outside, storm clouds began rolling in, darkening the sky as night fell across Ellenton. Maria stood silently in the room, heart pounding. She had seen things in her career, but never something like this. Whoever had created that wall wasn't just kidnapping children. They were cataloging them, tracking them. This wasn't random. At the same time, Paul made a discovery of his own. He was reviewing old maps of the park and noticed something odd. Drainage tunnel that ran beneath the woods, sealed off years ago after a minor flood. It hadn't been part of the official search, likely overlooked since it was marked as collapsed. But Paul remembered a story from an old maintenance guy years ago about that tunnel being used as a shortcut by kids back in the day. He decided to check it himself. With just a flashlight and his notebook, Paul headed out in the rain. The entrance to the tunnel was half covered in vines and roots, but still accessible. He crouched down and peered inside. Cold air rushed out like a breath, damp and heavy. He hesitated, then crawled in. The tunnel was narrow, the ceiling low. Water dripped from the sides and rats scurried in the shadows. Paul pressed forward, breath shallow. About 30 feet in, the tunnel widened slightly. That's when he saw its scratches along the walls, not natural erosion, carved lines. Names he spotted, one word over and over: help. Then, just before the tunnel curved, he found a piece of cloth caught on a jagged bolt. Pink, torn. The same fabric as Maddie's jacket. Paul backed out and called Maria immediately. Within hours, the tunnel was sealed off and a full forensic team was sent in. The cloth was real. The markings were real. Maddie had been there. Maybe recently, maybe not. But again, it confirmed what they feared. This had been going on longer than anyone thought. Then came the second voicemail. It was shorter than the first. Same distorted voice, same hollow tone. You're running out of time. You missed the door. She didn't. It ended with a click. Maria's blood ran cold. She didn't tell the public, not yet, but she knew what it meant. There was another entrance, another door they hadn't found, and Maddie had used it. Back at headquarters, they brought in new search equipment, heat sensors, deep ground radar. They started mapping every underground point within a mile of the park, including old utility plans and forgotten blueprints. Time was slipping. Maria could feel it. And then, just before midnight, one of the FBI drones caught movement in the woods. Small, quick, a figure darting between trees before vanishing near the back fence. Maria didn't wait. She grabbed her gear and went out there herself. The woods were quiet, except for the wind and the occasional snap of a branch underfoot. Her flashlight scanned the trees. Nothing. Then something flickered to the left. A small beam of light just for a second. Like a reflection, she moved closer, breath tight in her chest. There, near the roots of an old oak tree, was something barely visible in the ground, a thin seam in the dirt. Shaped like a square dot, another trapdoor. Maria reached for her radio voice. "Low, I found something. I need backup." Quiet, but deep down, she knew. This was it. This was the door they missed. Maria bent down slowly, brushing away the dirt with trembling fingers until the full outline of the trapdoor came into view. It was older than the one they'd already discovered. The wood was warped, covered in moss, and part of it was reinforced with rusty steel bands. It blended so well with the forest floor that even a trained eye could have walked past it 100 times. She tapped her radio again, whispering urgently for the backup team to hurry. But even as she waited, something inside her said she couldn't stand still. Not now. Not when they might be seconds away from Maddie. She gripped the handle, which resisted at first, then groaned as she pulled it open. A breath of stale, cold air surged upward. She aimed her flashlight down into the blackness. There was a ladder like before, but this one descended much deeper, far enough that her light couldn't reach the bottom. She paused, heart hammering, then started down one rung at a time as she descended. A sound floated up from below, barely a whisper, like breathing or crying. She stopped to listen. Nothing. She kept going. The air grew colder the farther down. She went, the walls narrower. At the base was a tunnel, carved crudely through dirt and rock. She moved slowly, careful not to make noise. Then she saw it. A door at the end, metal, shut tight. But someone had scrawled words into the surface with what looked like a nail or a key. "Don't open unless you're ready." Her radio crackled to life behind her. Backup was only minutes away. But before she could respond, she heard something. Behind the door, a bang, then silence. Her fingers hovered over the handle. She didn't know what she expected. But she turned it anyway. The door creaked open to a room much larger than the first. It wasn't just a holding space. It looked lived in. A cot in the corner, shelves filled with old food cans, a lantern still burning. On the far wall were pictures, dozens of them, not just of Maddie, but other children. Faces Maria didn't recognize. Some photos were decades old. The pictures weren't random. They were arranged in rows by year, each labeled carefully in handwriting that looked eerily familiar. Then, her eyes landed on a framed photo of a child different from the rest. A little girl with blonde hair and a wide smile. It was Maddie, but younger. And standing next to her was someone Maria recognized immediately. Paul Renshaw. Her stomach dropped. She stared at the photo, frozen. It wasn't just that Paul knew Maddie, it was that he had been in her life before anyone realized. Not just as the janitor, not just as the quiet man in the background, but someone closer. The sound of footsteps made her spin around. A figure appeared in the doorway behind her, silhouetted by the flashlight beam. For a moment, She couldn't make out who it was. Then Paul stepped into the light. He didn't look surprised to see her. In fact, he looked calm. "I knew you'd find this place eventually," he said softly. "I just didn't think it would be tonight." Maria reached slowly for her weapon, not drawing it yet. "You need to tell me what this is, right now." Paul's eyes drifted around the room. "This isn't what you think it is. I didn't take Maddie. But I've been protecting someone, for a long time." "Why is your photo on the wall with her?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked to the shelf and picked up a small worn notebook. "Because I was there when this all started. 30 years ago, before you were even in Ellenton, there was another girl. Name was Claire, and she disappeared just like Maddie. Same age, same park." Maria's pulse raced. She had never seen that case in any record. "She was my sister," Paul continued. "They never found her. My parents were destroyed. And I made a promise I would never let it happen again. So I started watching. And when I noticed the patterns repeating, kids disappearing, odd people around the park, I knew it was the same person, or someone connected to them." Maria's thoughts churned. Was Paul trying to say he was some kind of guardian? Or was this just a twisted attempt to justify something worse? "You built these rooms?" she asked. He nodded. "I found the old tunnels first. They've been under this town for decades. Some were used during the war, some for smuggling. I cleaned them out, repurposed what I could. I figured if kids were being taken, I'd need a place to bring them back, somewhere safe. But I was always too late." Maria didn't buy all of it. "Then why the photos? Why hide this?" Paul looked at her, eyes tired. "Because someone in Ellenton knows. Someone with access. And every time I got close, they shut me down. People disappeared. I stopped talking. I stayed quiet. I figured if I could get close, maybe I could stop it from inside. I just didn't realize Maddie would be the next." Before Maria could ask more, her radio crackled again, this time with urgency. "Agent Benton, we've located a second van matching the description. It's parked near your current location. Engine's still warm." Paul's face changed. He stepped back. "It's happening again." Maria rushed toward the tunnel entrance, heart slamming against her ribs. But as she climbed, another officer's voice came through the radio, breathless. "Ma'am, we've got movement in the woods. Someone's running, and we've got eyes on a child. Possibly Maddie." Then everything went silent. Maria burst from the tunnel as headlights swept the trees. Officers scattered in all directions. A dog barked in the distance. Flashlights lit up the forest. And somewhere, out in the dark, a girl's voice echoed faint. "Scared? Help me." Maria took off running. She didn't know if it was real. She didn't know if Maddie was finally there. But something was waiting at the end. Maria ran harder than she ever had in her life. Branches scraped her arms, mud soaked her boots, and the rain was falling harder now, blurring the flashlights bobbing ahead in the dark woods. Every sound felt magnified, the crunch of leaves. Underfoot, the pounding of her heart, and then that voice again. Clearer this time. A cry, "Help me." It was a child. And it wasn't just echoing. Neat was moving. She veered left, pushing through thick underbrush, her flashlight cutting wild beams through the trees. Up ahead, two officers had stopped near an old stone drainage culvert, barely visible behind the overgrowth. One of them looked back at her, wide-eyed. "We think she's in there," he said, breathless. "We heard her just a minute ago." Maria dropped to her knees and peered inside the narrow opening. It was just large enough for a child to slip through, but too small for an adult. She shined her light in and caught a glimpse of tiny legs, muddy, trembling. A girl, curled up, her hair matted and face streaked with dirt. It was Maddie. Caroline arrived moments later, barely able to stand. She screamed when she saw her daughter trying to run forward, but officers held her back. Maria called out gently, "Maddie, it's okay. We're here now. You're safe." The girl looked up slowly, eyes dazed but alive. "Are you the police?" she asked. Maria nodded. "Yes, sweetheart. Let's get you home." They got her out carefully, wrapped in a warm blanket, and carried her to the waiting ambulance. Carolyn broke down the moment she touched her daughter again. It wasn't just tears, was relief, years of it, crashing all at once. Maddie clung to her mother, whispering something over and over. "I thought no one would come." At the station, as Maddie was checked by doctors and reunited with her family, Maria sat with Paul in an interrogation room. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He just sat quietly, staring at the table. "You were right about the tunnels," she said. "But you left something out." He didn't answer. Maria slid a photo across the table. One they'd found inside the hidden room. It wasn't one of Maddie. It was of Paul Young, maybe in his 20s, standing next to another man. That man had come up in the investigation weeks ago. Nick Avery, the security guard who vanished after Maddie disappeared. "You said you were trying to stop whoever did this," Maria said. "But the truth is, it was closer than you let on. Nick was your nephew." Paul nodded once. "I didn't." "No, it was him. Not at first, but you figured it out." He took a breath, shaky. "When Maddie went missing, I saw how shaken he was, not sad, panicked. That's when I started following him. But by the time I found the trapdoor, it was too late. She was gone. He'd moved her. I couldn't prove anything, I thought. If I exposed him, he'd hurt her. So I waited. I watched. I left the ribbon there on purpose. I needed the police to look again." Maria's chest tightened. "You used us." "I tried to save her," Paul said. "I knew he had another spot, but I didn't know where. He was paranoid. He never told me. I thought if the town started digging again, he'd panic. He'd make a mistake." He was right. Nick had been watching. When he saw the investigation flare up again, he moved Maddie. But this time, he'd been sloppy. A footprint. A torn cloth. And then, that voicemail sent not by Nick, but by Paul. A last-ditch effort to push the police in the right direction. Later that night, a call came in from a gas station outside of town. A man had abandoned a white van and run into the woods. Behind the lot, a search team was dispatched immediately. Hours later, they found Nick Avery, alive, armed, cornered. But he didn't fight. He was tired, disoriented, muttering things under his breath about not being alone, about a second man, about the others. When officers arrested him, he said one last thing to Maria. "You only found one." That phrase rattled her dot. At first, everyone believed Maddie's rescue was the end, that the nightmare was finally over. But as Maria dug deeper, she found missing children cases that shared similar details dating back decades, all within rural towns across the Southeast. The same signs, the same patterns. It wasn't just a Lendon. And Nick wasn't working alone when they processed the room under the second trapdoor. Investigators discovered a locked box hidden behind a false panel. Inside were dozens of old cassette tapes, each labeled with dates. Some were marked with initials they hadn't yet figured out what was on them, but it was clear. This wasn't a one-time case. It was part of something bigger, something ongoing. The final twist came the next morning, while reviewing security footage from Maddie's hospital wing. An officer spotted something odd. A nurse entered her room around 3 a.m., looked around nervously, then walked out carrying something. The camera caught her face clearly. She wasn't a nurse, and what she left behind was a note tucked under Maddie's pillow. Maria read it herself. You saved one, but others are still waiting. Don't stop now. The hunt. For the first time in 6 long months, the sun rose over Ellenton without the weight of silence. The town that had once been buried in fear began to exhale. Mattie Ellis was home. Not just in name or memory, but in flesh and spirit, live, held. In her mother's arms, surrounded by people who never stopped looking. It didn't erase the pain or the long, dark days they'd endured, but it gave Ellenton something that had nearly vanished. Hope Caroline stayed close to Mattie in those early days. The little girl barely spoke at first. Doctors and child psychologists called it trauma-induced mutism. She responded to her mother's touch, nodded or shook her head when needed, but her voice remained quiet. Still, she smiled against small, careful smiles. And once, as Caroline brushed her daughter's hair in the soft morning light, Mattie whispered something. You didn't stop. Caroline broke down all over again. But this time, the tears weren't from pain. They were from pride, relief, and something deeper gratitude for the people who'd refused to let her child become a name on a poster. Detective Maria Benton didn't rest much in the days that followed. Nick Avery was being held without bail, his charges growing with each passing day as investigators pored through his journals, tapes, and hidden caches. What emerged was a chilling web of abductions that stretched beyond Georgia. Mattie's case had cracked something wide open. And as painful as it was to know more children had suffered, there was also power in that knowledge. Now there were leads, names, trails to follow. The FBI launched a multi-state task force to investigate what they now believed was a long-running operation, and Maria was asked to remain on the case as a consultant. Paul Renshaw was not charged with the crime. After weeks of scrutiny and investigation, it became clear that he had not aided the abductions, but his silence. His secrets and his choices raised ethical questions the town would wrestle with for a long time. He quietly retired from his job at the park. Most people didn't know what to say to him, and Paul didn't seek comfort. He kept to himself, still living in the same small house on the edge of town, occasionally seen walking the park trails just after dawn. Whether people saw him as a hero or a man who waited too long to speak, they all agreed on one thing: he had helped bring Mattie home. The tapes found under the second trapdoor became central to the larger investigation. Most of them were audio. Logs recorded by Nick himself, documenting his movements, his observations, and chillingly, his reflections. But in one of the tapes stated a year before Mattie disappeared, another voice could be heard. Calm, older, giving instructions. They ran the audio through analysis and confirmed what Maria had feared. Nick hadn't acted alone. There was a second man, one who had yet to be identified. That led to a deeper search of every property Nick had ever lived in or worked around. They found another trapdoor site in North Carolina, this one long abandoned, but with evidence of the same setup: a cot, drawings, notes, and in the corner, something new: a list. Mattie's name was there. So were 3 others. 2 of those children had been found safe in different states, recovered by local authorities years earlier with no explanation of where they had been. The third name belonged to a girl still missing. Maria sat with that file for a long time. The feeling in her gut, the same one that kept her awake at night, told her this case wouldn't end with one arrest. But at least now the world was looking. Parents who'd given up started calling again. Missing persons reports were reopened. And thanks to the Mattie Ellis case, the media kept the spotlight bright. Back in Ellenton, life slowly began to rebuild. The town council decided not to shut down Magnolia Park, though much of it was fenced off for renovations and safety inspections. A small plaque was placed near the swing set, with the words, "For the ones who made it home, man, the ones we still search for." Caroline and Mattie moved in with Jen for a while, away from the old house with too many memories. The doctors said it would take time for Maddie to fully open up. But she was already drawing again pictures of sunshine, her mom, even the swing set. One of them showed a woman holding a flashlight, standing in the woods. When Carolyn asked who it was, Maddie smiled and whispered, "She found me." It was hard to explain what Ellenton had gone through to people who didn't live there. On the surface, it was a small town like any other. But the disappearance and return of Maddie Ellis had changed something in the air. Neighbors who used to pass each other with polite nods now stopped to talk. Porch lights stayed on a little longer. And whenever a child laughed in the park again, someone would pause and just listen. Maria eventually visited Maddie at home. Not in uniform, just as a friend. They sat in the living room while Caroline made tea and Maria handed the little girl a soft stuffed bear one she used to keep on her desk. Maddie hugged it tightly. "He can stay here now," she said, as she drove home that evening. Maria thought about all the pieces that had come together, how one janitor's discovery, one frightened girl's bravery, and one mother's unbreakable will had exposed something that might have remained hidden forever. Maddie's story had started as a mystery, turned into a nightmare, but in the end, it had become a fight they hadn't lost. The final twist came quietly. Weeks later, while reviewing old maintenance logs from the park, a young officer found something odd. A signature on an equipment rental form from 7 years earlier, long before Nick Avery's time. It matched the handwriting on the hidden photo labels. The name wasn't Nick's. It wasn't Paul's. It was someone else. Entirely. Someone who'd once worked for a regional child welfare agency. Someone who had access to records, homes, vulnerable families. His name hadn't come up in any of their databases. Until now. Maria stared at the form, realizing that the hunt wasn't just about Maddie anymore. The system they were up against was larger than any one town, but now they had a name, a place to start. The next step, she closed the file and stood by the window, watching the sunset bleed across the sky. Ellenton would sleep easier tonight, but the search for the others, those still missing, those still hiding, would continue.